Hey guys, this is Miss Edmonds here. Just wanted to talk you through, for anyone who needs a little bit more help on the source questions. There's a few sort of common errors coming through, and I know it's tricky when you're at home, sort of think through and just read it, and if it's still not getting in, I just thought maybe it's worth listening and me talking you through it whilst we have a little practice on one, and then you can have a go at the other one. So you have two questions for your sources. I'll start with this one, question 2a. It's always how useful. So it's how useful are sources A and B? And then obviously the inquiry bit after, which changes. It could be something about asking you about the sort of casualty clearing stations. It could be asking you about surgery. It could be asking about anything. So the first job is always to highlight the bits in the question that we're looking for. So in this case, we're looking for illnesses and wounds that soldiers experienced on the Western Front. This question, how useful, there are always, as I said, two sources, A and B. What we're looking at is two written sources, but it could be one picture, it could be one written, it could be two pictures. If anything, two written ones are a bit easier. I know it's a bit more reading, but as some of you found in the assessment, if you have a picture source, sometimes it's a bit harder to pick details from it. Sometimes you forget or sometimes you're not sure, so you leave it out. That can be quite impactful on your marks. So, although words, sometimes we don't like reading those, actually it's a little bit easier. So let's start with source A and just remind ourselves we're looking for anything to do with illnesses and wounds that soldiers experience. So what does it tell us? So I'm going to dive straight into reading the actual source because the bit about where it's from isn't necessarily that important at the minute. So the gangrene, right, so we've got our wound there straight away, found amongst our wounded soldiers is directly due to infection introduced at the time of the wound. So it's due to infection. And this is likely to occur if muddy clothing has been carried by the projectile. So that could be, whatever's basically penetrated their skin. So a bullet, whatever it might be, shrapnel, or if earth has been carried by the explosion. So now you've finished reading the source, we're still thinking about what is it telling us? Well, it tells us about gangrene. That's as simple as it is. And gas gangrene is the actual word for it, if you remember. It's not gangrene as in the one that creates, trench foot, sort of sitting in water or not getting dry. It's not that one. It's called gas gangrene. So let's have a look at source B now. The shelling was bad. You could hear the big shells coming, although if you could hear them, that was all right. They'd just gone over. You never heard the whiz bangs coming. They were just there. And you never heard the shell or the bullet that hit you. Right, so we have bullet there. Of course, whiz bangs were shrapnel, and that was worse than a bullet. A bullet wound was clean. Shrapnel would tear you to pieces. It was a whiz bang that killed my three friends and wounded me. It was just bad luck. They had those 4 magazines over their shoulders, fully loaded. That's why they all got blown to pieces. Magazines, obviously, to do with, quite likely, probably a machine gun. So what we've got here, it's telling us about shelling and it's telling us about bullets. So that's the main thing it's telling us about. But bullet wounds and shrapnel. And it goes further. It does actually say that the bullet wound was better, obviously, unless it went in your head. And shrapnel would be the one that would kill you because it could completely tear you to pieces and cause infection. Now, I've gone further. I'm using my own knowledge there, but that is what it's saying. So your first job, when you've looked at those sources, remember we're treating them separately. A few of you missed marks because you took them together. Remember the question is saying how useful are sources A and B. It's not saying how useful are the sources or is one source more useful than the other. There's no conclusion. It's literally a paragraph on A and a paragraph on B. So if you looked at the criteria, there are actually 3 sections on how to do this. The first section is what we've just been doing. So it's like, what does it tell us? So that's that bit there. The next section, number 2, is, well, is that true? I'll use green for that. And then the last section is, well, is that a helpful source? We'll come back to that in a minute. So the first bit, we've identified for source A that it tells us about that gas gangrene infection was caused by the conditions on the Western Front. So that's just what I've talked about here. Now, what you've got to do is give an example. Quite a few of you just sort of left it there with your assessment. Like, okay, it tells me about the dressing stations, for example, were really busy, or that it took a long time to get to them. There weren't enough stretcher bearers, but you didn't actually use the quote from the source, which is what you have to do. So for this bit here, I'd like you to fill in the source says, and we could say, we could use this one, couldn't we? That you could say it was likely to occur if muddy clothing has been carried, or if earth has been carried by the explosion. Or you could use directly due to infection introduced at the time of the wound. Doesn't matter which one you use, you need to give a quote to say what it's telling you. Then we go on to accuracy. This is where, in your head, in the exam, you go back into your bank of knowledge. But right now, we're doing this as a practice. You should have your booklet open in front of you, and you should have the page on injuries, and you should be looking at gas gangrene. You should be thinking, well, what does it tell me? So if you have a little look at that section and think, well, is that true? What I read there in source A, do I know that to be true? And the fact of the matter is, it is true. Gas gangrene was caused by some of the soil that they used, the farmer's soil that had like things like fermentation stuff in it, things to make the soil grow. It had bacteria and it got into people's wounds, and that caused gas gangrene, as did mud on clothing. And that caused infection, and it caused, as you can see, gangrene from wounds. So we can use our knowledge here now that the more specific, this is the bit that a few people lost marks on. You said things like, I know this is true because I know it happened. That's not really going to cut it. You need some sort of fact to go back to that page, find me a fact and jot it in here. Then we're on to the reliability bit. You're always pretty good at this one in terms of tap and type. You've got quite strong, but I would recommend some of us are not necessarily getting the full explanation in. And I'll talk you through why. So we go back to this bit now. So is the source reliable? Is it helpful? Is it useful? Will it tell us everything? So from a report on gas gangrene by Anthony Bowlby, consulting surgeon to the British Army, October 1914. So if we're looking for an inquiry into the wounds and illnesses on the Western Front, well, I can imagine a surgeon of the British Army is going to be pretty useful for that, especially as he's making a report on gas gangrene. So he's there at the time. There's a lot of things that are working in the favour at this point. So I've gone for the source is very reliable as it was created by a consulting surgeon to the British Army in 1914. Therefore, this bit is the bit people have been missing. You're really good at saying it was made at the time, it was made by someone who was there, or it has, the purpose of informing, so it's really reliable, or the type of source is helpful, but you don't make that connection back to the question. Now you need to say, well, what would it tell us about illnesses and wounds? So I've said, therefore, he would have access to information about wounds and expert knowledge on how these were caused. Of course, the cynic in me would also be like, well, do you know what though? It's October 1914. It doesn't tell me everything about the whole war. And it only tells me about one actual illness. So there's a little bit of, lack of usefulness there as well. Right, moving on to source B now. I'll just move it down slightly. So source B, we'll go through the same process. We don't need a judgment in terms of comparing the sources. We just need to say, right, now it's source B's turn. So source B is also useful in telling us about 2 injuries this time, caused by shelling, bullets and shrapnel. And then you do the same thing. Get me a piece of evidence, get me a quote from up here, get me something that tells me that that's what is actually being said. Then you move on, same again. Step number 2, is that true? Is it true that shrapnel is a problem? Go back to your page in the booklet. You should still be on it, to be honest. Find me the bit on shrapnel. I'm sure there are some nice little percentages you could use about bullets and shrapnel, about how that's a problem and how it affects people. Get me something really specific, a fact. And then lastly, again, is the source reliable? So this time we're going to look back up to source B. It's from the Memories of Private Harry Patch of the Duke of Cornwall's Light Infantry, describing events in 1917. Now you might, if you were reading it quickly and not clearly, because you do it in an exam, you get a bit stressed, you probably might just read this bit. He's just describing events in 1917. Great, he was there at the time. Well, he was, but it's from his memories. I don't know if you know anything about Harry Patch. He was actually described as the last Tommy, and he was just, I think he died a couple of years ago now, but he was in the news recently because he basically didn't speak about the war. He was in a nursing home. He never spoke about the war after, until he suddenly started speaking about it. And these are his memories from sort of a few years ago. We're talking 100 years after this event. So that's problematic, isn't it? But he was still there. So I've said the source is fairly reliable as it was created by a soldier, who experienced the shelling firsthand, and his description is detailed. You know, if you were saying, well, he had problems with memory, that is true. I've said after that. However, he recalled this from memory, so it might be affected by the passing of time. Very true, but it is really detailed. He remembers it really specifically, so that's still, in my mind, fairly reliable. So that's basically 3 steps, and you repeat them times 2. And that, if you do all of those things, including that sort of developed explanation, will get you all the marks you need for this question. Good luck.